Somewhere in South America right now, a driver pulls up to a petrol station, fills an entire tank, and hands over a handful of coins, so small in value that they barely register as money. The transaction, if you can even call it that, costs less than a single bottle of water from the shop next door. The gasoline costs approximately 2 cents per liter. The bottled water next to the register costs 30 times more. This is not a glitch. This is not a special discount. This is official government policy in Venezuela, the country that sits on top of more proven oil reserves than any other nation on earth. More oil underground than Saudi Arabia, more than Canada, more than Iran, more than Iraq and Russia combined. 303 billion barrels of hydrocarbon wealth buried beneath its soil and its lake beds. Enough oil to supply the entire planet for nearly 8 years at current consumption rates. The country that has more oil than anyone else on the planet gives its gasoline away for almost nothing. And at the same time, it cannot reliably stock basic food in its supermarkets. It cannot keep medicine in its hospitals. It has seen more than 7 million of its own citizens abandon everything and flee. Its economy has suffered one of the most catastrophic collapses in modern history, without a war, without a natural disaster, driven entirely by the decisions its own governments made about the extraordinary wealth sitting beneath its feet. This is the story of how a country won the geological lottery, spent its winnings on political survival, and ended up with gasoline cheaper than bottled water and almost nothing else. Before the oil, Venezuela was an agricultural country of modest means. Cocoa, coffee, cattle. Farmers and laborers working land that was fertile in places, but not spectacularly productive. Caracas was a small capital city. The country was not especially wealthy and not especially poor by regional standards. It was, in many ways, a typical Latin American nation of the early 20th century. Young, unstable, running through presidents and military leaders with the speed that colonial independence had made common across the continent. Then, a drilling crew found oil near Lake Maracaibo. The first commercial well, the Zumaque, was drilled on the eastern shores of that lake in 1914. The find was significant but modest. What changed everything came 8 years later, in 1922, when drillers struck a gusher in the same region that blew completely out of control. The well known as Los Barrosos II erupted with such force that it sprayed crude oil into the air for 9 days before crews could bring it under control, spewing more than 100,000 barrels a day. The sheer scale of what lay beneath Lake Maracaibo became unmistakable. The foreign oil companies that had been operating cautiously in Venezuela suddenly understood they were sitting on something extraordinary. Within a decade, Venezuela had been transformed. By 1929, oil accounted for more than 91% of Venezuela's total exports. A country that had been exporting coffee and cocoa was now exporting the most valuable commodity in the industrial world in enormous volumes. By the late 1920s, Venezuela had become the world's largest exporter of oil, surpassing the United States and every other producer. Foreign capital arrived at a pace that Venezuela's institutions had never been designed to absorb. Dutch, British, and American oil companies poured investment into the country. Workers migrated from the countryside to the oil fields. The economy reorganized itself entirely around a single product in a matter of years. By 1950, the transformation had gone so deep that Venezuela had become the fourth wealthiest nation on earth by GDP per capita. Not the fourth wealthiest in Latin America, fourth in the entire world. By the 1960s, Venezuela was producing more than 10% of all the crude oil extracted globally, and its per capita income was several times larger than that of its neighbors Brazil and Colombia. It was, in the language of the era, the Saudi Arabia of the Western Hemisphere. The 1970s were the peak, when the OPEC oil embargo of 1973 quadrupled the price of crude oil globally. Venezuelan government revenues exploded. The government of President Carlos Andrés Pérez found itself in the extraordinary position of having more money arriving in the national treasury than the country could spend productively. In the 5 years between 1974 and 1979, Venezuela's government spent more money in absolute terms than it had in its entire previous independent history. The country's per capita GDP rose to approximately 90% of American levels, a figure that sounds almost impossible today, but was real and documented. What did this extraordinary wealth look like on the ground? Venezuelans in the urban middle class drove Cadillacs and Buicks. Scotch whiskey consumption in Venezuela was, per capita, the highest in the world. The wealthy class of Caracas flew to Miami for weekend shopping trips and became known locally as Dame dos, Spanish for give me two, because the answer to any price question in any American shop was simply to buy two of whatever was being offered. The country built highways, universities, hospitals. Literacy improved, infant mortality fell. For a brief, glittering window, Venezuela looked like proof that a developing nation could use commodity wealth to purchase a genuine leap into prosperity. But underneath the glitter, a structural problem was building that no one in power wanted to confront, because confronting it would have required admitting that the prosperity was borrowed rather than built. As oil revenues grew, agriculture and manufacturing shrank. Why would anyone invest the hard work of farming or building a factory when oil money made those activities economically pointless? Venezuelan workers left the fields for the cities. Imports replaced domestic production. The diversity of economic activity that would have provided resilience was systematically hollowed out by the ease of oil income. Economists who study this pattern have a name for it: the resource curse. The idea that natural resource wealth, rather than creating development, actually destroys it by eliminating the incentives to develop other industries, distorting currency values, concentrating power in the state, and creating political systems organized around controlling the resource rather than building productive capacity. Venezuela was becoming a textbook case. And it was doing so at a speed that would have impressed even the most pessimistic resource curse theorist. This is the moment in the story where the gasoline enters the picture. Because the gasoline subsidy was not an accident of economics. It was a deliberate political choice made by Venezuelan governments in the era of oil wealth and maintained through every subsequent crisis as a tool of social peace. The logic was simple and the politics were irresistible. Venezuela sits on vast oil reserves. Its state-owned company extracts that oil for a cost. Rather than selling the refined product to its own citizens at world market prices, the government chose to sell it at prices that reflected almost none of the actual production cost, let alone the global market value. In the early years, this seemed like a generous gift from a wealthy state to its people. The government could easily afford it. Oil revenues were so large that the cost of the subsidy was a rounding error in the national accounts. And the political dividend was enormous. Venezuelans understood viscerally that their oil was giving them something tangible, the ability to drive wherever they wanted for essentially nothing. Decades passed. The subsidy became a right in the minds of ordinary Venezuelans. Not a benefit that a government chose to offer, but an entitlement as fundamental as any other. Politicians understood this. Any leader who tried to reduce the gasoline subsidy would face not just political criticism, but genuine social rage. In 1989, President Perez had tried to implement an IMF austerity program that included fuel price increases. The result was the Caracazo, a wave of riots and looting in Caracas and other cities that left hundreds of people dead and set off years of political instability. The message was received and remembered by every subsequent government. Touching the gasoline price was political suicide. So the subsidy survived everything. It survived the oil glut of the 1980s, it survived the 1990s stagnation, it survived Chavez, it survived Maduro. As of today, a liter of gasoline in Venezuela costs approximately 2 cents. A liter of bottled water costs approximately 60 cents. Hugo Chavez himself acknowledged the absurdity publicly, saying on national television, "We are practically giving away gasoline. One day, prices will need to be adjusted." That was in 2009. The adjustment never came under his government, and it has not come since. The gasoline subsidy that a wealthy state could once afford as a political gesture had become a structural drain on an economy that could no longer remotely afford it, maintained by governments too afraid of their own people's expectations to stop it. Hugo Chavez arrived in Venezuelan politics through a coup attempt. In February 1992, as a lieutenant colonel in the Venezuelan army, he led an armed assault on the presidential palace and other strategic installations across the country. The coup failed. Chavez surrendered, appeared on national television to take responsibility, and asked his fellow conspirators to lay down their arms, and was imprisoned. He served 2 years and was pardoned. The brief televised appearance, in which he was the only coup leader willing to show his face publicly and speak honestly about what had happened, made him a celebrity. He ran for president in 1998 on a platform of using oil wealth to transform Venezuelan society for the benefit of the poor. He won with 56% of the vote. The first decade of Chavez's presidency contained genuine accomplishments alongside the structural decisions that would eventually destroy everything. Using oil revenues that boomed with global oil prices through the 2000s, his government launched massive social programs known as misiones. Medical clinics in poor neighborhoods, staffed by Cuban doctors imported as part of an oil for services deal with Havana. Subsidized food markets, adult literacy campaigns, housing construction. Between 1999 and 2009, poverty rates in Venezuela fell measurably. Unemployment dropped from 14.5% to 7.6%. GDP per capita more than doubled. At the peak of the Chavez oil boom, from 2006 to 2011, Venezuela's Human Development Index, which measures education, health, and income combined, improved at the third fastest pace of any country in the world. These real improvements were celebrated, globally and domestically, as proof that the Bolivarian Revolution was working. What was less visible in the celebrations was where the money was coming from and what was not being done with it. Chavez used oil revenue to fund current consumption rather than long-term investment. Infrastructure was not maintained. The oil industry was not reinvested in. Non-oil industries that might have provided economic diversity were not developed. They were often nationalized and then run into the ground. And crucially, the state oil company, PDVSA, whose revenues funded almost everything, was being systematically dismantled as a functioning business in favor of being used as a political instrument. In December 2002, workers at PDVSA went on strike. The immediate cause was a demand for early elections. But the deeper issue was the relationship between Chavez's government and the company that produced 90% of Venezuela's foreign exchange earnings. PDVSA under its previous management had been run as a genuine oil company, with professional engineers, geologists, and technical staff who understood the equipment, the geology, and the complex operations required to extract and process heavy crude oil. Chavez had been trying to subordinate the company to political control. The workers and managers resisted. The strike lasted approximately 2 months and virtually halted Venezuelan oil production during that period. When the government regained control, Chavez fired approximately 18,000 PDVSA workers. Around 40% of the entire workforce was dismissed in a matter of weeks. These were not ordinary workers. They were engineers, geologists, maintenance specialists, and operations managers with decades of accumulated expertise in one of the most technically demanding industries in the world. Venezuela's particular crude, the heavy, extra heavy oil of the Orinoco Belt, requires sophisticated upgrading technology to convert into useful fuel. Running those operations is not something you can learn quickly. The knowledge that left with those 18,000 workers had taken decades to build. Their replacements were chosen primarily for political loyalty rather than technical competence. Chavez viewed PDVSA not as an oil company that needed to be run like a business, but as a national resource that should be managed in service of his political project. Investment in maintaining aging infrastructure fell sharply. The technical capacity required to operate at peak efficiency declined year by year. From a peak production of approximately 3.5 million barrels per day in the late 1990s, Venezuela's output began a long, grinding, seemingly unstoppable decline. By the time Chavez died of cancer in March 2013, leaving power to his designated successor, Nicolás Maduro, PDVSA was already structurally incapable of meeting its own production targets. The crisis that followed Chavez's death is, by a significant margin, the most dramatic economic collapse any country in the modern world has experienced without fighting a war. To understand its scale, consider a single number. Venezuela's GDP in 2013, the year Maduro took office, was approximately $370 billion. By 2020, it had fallen to around $30 billion. That is not a recession. That is not a contraction. That is an 80% collapse. The United States, in the Great Depression, the most severe economic crisis in American history, saw GDP fall by roughly 27%. Venezuela lost more than 3 times that share of its economy in less than a decade, in peacetime, while sitting on the largest oil reserves in the world. The mechanism of collapse was not complicated. Oil prices fell sharply in 2014 and 2015. Venezuela's oil revenues, already weakened by declining production, fell off a cliff. The government, which had never saved oil revenues in a fund or invested them in a diversified economy, had no buffer. It needed money to pay for imports, for social programs, for the military apparatus that kept Maduro in power, for the debt obligations Chavez had accumulated. The Central Bank of Venezuela responded the way governments facing fiscal collapse have responded throughout history. It printed money. And it printed money. And it printed money. What followed was hyperinflation of a severity that genuinely belongs in the record books. In 2018, Venezuela's annual inflation rate reached approximately 1 million%. 1 million. Prices were doubling every few weeks. The bolivar, Venezuela's currency, became so worthless that vendors priced goods in dollars. Bricks of bills were weighed rather than counted in markets, and the government was forced to redenominate the currency multiple times, simply removing zeros to allow transactions to function at all. Workers received salary increases denominated in billions of bolivars that were worth fractions of a dollar by the time they reached their bank accounts. And here is the paradox that the gasoline price crystallizes in a single image. Throughout this entire catastrophe, while medicine disappeared from hospitals and food disappeared from supermarkets, while the currency lost all meaning and the economy collapsed around them, Venezuelans could still fill their tanks for essentially nothing. The gasoline subsidy survived hyperinflation, survived the collapse of PDVSA, survived the departure of more than 7 million citizens who abandoned the country entirely. The cost of the subsidy in real terms became almost meaningless as the currency collapsed, which is precisely why it survived. Eliminating a subsidy that costs you nothing in nominal terms carries all the political risk of eliminating a popular benefit and essentially zero fiscal savings. But the deeper perversity of the gasoline situation is what it revealed about the Venezuelan state's relationship with its own economy. The oil in the ground beneath Venezuela was worth, at any reasonable calculation, trillions of dollars. The country should have been able to fund world-class healthcare, education, and infrastructure from its petroleum revenues, while still selling domestic gasoline at a price that covered production costs. Norway proved this was possible. The UAE proved it was possible. Even Saudi Arabia, which maintains subsidized domestic fuel prices, has accumulated sovereign wealth funds and built a modern economy alongside its oil sector. Venezuela instead extracted the oil, sold it on global markets at below maximum efficiency due to decades of mismanagement, spent the revenues on immediate political consumption rather than long-term investment, gave the refined product away domestically at a price that didn't cover the cost of the electricity used to run the refinery, and watched the entire system collapse when oil prices fell and the political system could no longer function without the subsidy of high oil prices. The gasoline at 2 cents per liter was not a benefit to the Venezuelan people. It was the last remaining symbol of a promise that the state no longer had the capacity to keep, maintained at almost zero nominal cost, precisely because the currency in which it was priced had become almost worthless. Here is the number that should haunt anyone who thinks about resource economics. Venezuela has 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. Saudi Arabia, the country most people think of as the world's greatest oil power, has approximately 267 billion barrels. Venezuela's reserves exceed Saudi Arabia's by approximately 36 billion barrels. Canada, the third largest reserve holder, has 170 billion. Iran has 208 billion. Iraq, which has been the subject of a war partly about oil, has 146 billion. Venezuela's oil wealth is not theoretical or contested. It is certified by OPEC, verified by independent geological surveys, and has been recognized as the world's largest reserve base since approximately 2011. On paper, every Venezuelan citizen should be entitled to extraordinary wealth from the extraction and sale of that oil over the coming decades. The reserves are so large that at sustainable extraction rates, they represent not just this generation's inheritance, but potentially many generations. Yet Venezuela's oil exports generated approximately $4 billion in revenue in 2023. Saudi Arabia's oil exports generated approximately $181 billion in the same year. A country with more oil than Saudi Arabia earned less than a 50th as much from that oil. The difference is almost entirely a product of production capacity. Venezuela produced less than 1 million barrels per day in recent years, compared to a peak of more than 3.5 million barrels per day in the late 1990s. The oil is there. The infrastructure to extract it at scale no longer reliably works. The technical expertise to operate that infrastructure was fired in 2003 and has never been fully rebuilt. The foreign investment that might have modernized the industry was driven away by nationalizations, legal unpredictability, and the chaotic financial environment created by hyperinflation. A number that tells the human cost of what happened in Venezuela more starkly than any economic statistic. More than 7 million Venezuelans have left the country since 2015. To understand what this means, consider the scale. Venezuela's total population is approximately 28 million people. This means that roughly 1 in 4 Venezuelans has left. The exodus is the largest displacement crisis in Latin American history and one of the largest refugee movements anywhere in the world in the 21st century. The countries absorbing most of the migrants, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, Chile, are all significantly poorer than Venezuela was at its peak. People who had grown up in what was once the richest country in South America were walking across borders into countries that Venezuela once looked down upon as economically backward. They left because food was unavailable or unaffordably expensive, because medicine had disappeared from hospitals that lacked the resources to stock it, because electricity was rationed and blackouts lasted for days, because the healthcare system that had been a genuine achievement of the early Chavez years had been destroyed by the collapse in public spending, because wages, even after frequent government increases, could not buy a week's groceries, and because the political system had become so controlling and so hostile to dissent that the realistic choices were silence, imprisonment, or departure. The people who left were disproportionately the educated, the skilled, the entrepreneurial, precisely the people most capable of rebuilding Venezuela's economy. Engineers, doctors, teachers, lawyers, business owners. The same pattern that had devastated PDVSA when Chavez fired its technical staff repeated itself at the scale of the entire society. Human capital, once lost to emigration, is extraordinarily difficult to recover. The people who built their careers and their lives in Colombia or Peru or Spain are not waiting to return. They have built new lives, had children in new countries, found professional recognition in environments that reward their skills. Venezuela's great export, in the end, was not oil. It was its own educated middle class. Venezuela is the most dramatic case, but it is not alone in this strange economy where gasoline costs less than water. Libya currently holds the record for the cheapest gasoline on earth at approximately 9 cents per gallon as of 2026. A Libyan driver can fuel a car for a few minutes' worth of typical wages and drive across the entire country on the equivalent of a few dollars. Libya, like Venezuela, sits on enormous oil reserves and has used the income from those reserves to subsidize domestic fuel almost to zero. Libya, also like Venezuela, went through a catastrophic political collapse. It's triggered by the NATO-supported overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, which left the country divided between rival governments and militias, its oil infrastructure controlled by competing factions, and its civilian population substantially poorer than they were under the dictatorship the intervention was designed to end. Iran is the third country in the group below 15 cents per gallon. Iran's fuel subsidy, which the government has tried multiple times to reduce, triggered deadly riots in 2019 when prices were raised, leading to one of the largest crackdowns on photographers in the Islamic Republic's history. The pattern is consistent across all three. Governments that subsidize gasoline to near zero as a way of distributing oil wealth find that the subsidy quickly becomes politically impossible to remove. The population organizes its economic life around the subsidy. Business models depend on it. Political expectations solidify around it. And when fiscal pressures eventually force a reduction, the result is social explosion that typically ends with the reduction being reversed or the government being destabilized. The common thread is not geography or religion or colonial history. The common thread is a specific policy choice: to distribute oil wealth as a consumption subsidy rather than investing it in productive capacity, institutional quality, or a savings fund that could sustain wealth beyond the oil era. Norway chose differently. The Faroe Islands, with their salmon, chose differently. Luxembourg chose differently, through financial services rather than natural resources. The question of what a country does with its natural advantage, whether it converts a temporary windfall into lasting institutions, or spends it maintaining political loyalty at 2 cents a litre, determines whether the windfall becomes a foundation or a trap. Today, in Venezuela, the gasoline subsidy that Hugo Chavez called practically giving it away, and that cost 30 times less than bottled water when he said it in 2009, still exists. The price is still measured in fractions of cents. The political impossibility of removing it has not diminished. If anything, it has grown stronger as the poverty around it has deepened, because the gasoline, however meaningless its economic value at 2 cents a litre, represents to ordinary Venezuelans the last tangible proof that the state is giving them something. Everything else, the healthcare, the food, the stable currency, the functioning economy, has been stripped away. But they can still fill their tanks. What the gasoline price reveals in its absurdity is the final accounting of what the resource curse actually costs. It costs the future. Oil that could have been converted into Norwegian-style sovereign wealth, or Scottish-style industrial expertise, or Faroese-style sustainable industry, was converted instead into political support, measured in subsidized bolivars per litre, generation by generation, until the currency that denominated those subsidies was worth less than the gasoline it was supposed to purchase. Venezuela did not run out of oil. It still has more oil than anyone else on the planet, sitting untouched beneath its soil, waiting for the infrastructure that could extract it to be rebuilt, for the technical expertise that could run it to return, for the political and institutional conditions that would allow investment to arrive. The oil is there. The country built to use it is not. The great paradox of Venezuela is not that gasoline is cheaper than bottled water. That is just arithmetic. The great paradox is that the most oil-rich country on earth spent its geological inheritance on 2-cent fuel and social programs funded by printed money, and ended up unable to run the pumps that could have made everyone genuinely rich. The cheapest gasoline in the world turned out to be the most expensive. It just charged its price in something other than money. It charged it in everything else.